Hey there. Tonight we're settling in with a tale from the lands between, a story about kindness that conceals something far darker. We're going to explore the complete saga of Miquella the Kind, an Empyrean whose compassion may be the most terrifying force in all of Elden Ring. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the world you're resting in. It's always comforting to know who else is out there, drifting off to these stories. Now get comfortable, pull your blankets close, let the world outside fade away. Because the story of Miquella is one that will haunt your dreams, not with monsters or violence, but with something more unsettling. The horror of love that isn't freely given, the terror of kindness that strips away your very will. This is a tale about a god who wanted to save the world by taking away its ability to choose anything else. The cursed birth of an Empyrean. In the shattered world of the lands between, where gods walked among mortals and the very fabric of reality bent to the will of the Elden Ring, there was born a child who should never have existed. This child was Miquella, and from the moment of his first breath, he was marked by tragedy. To understand Miquella, you must first understand the impossibility of his existence. His parents were Queen Marika the Eternal and Radahn of the Golden Order. But here's where things become strange, even by the twisted standards of the lands between. Marika and Radahn were not two separate beings joined in marriage. They were one entity, split into two forms, two personalities inhabiting the same divine essence. Marika was the goddess who ascended to power through the Gate of Divinity, who wielded the Elden Ring and shaped the very laws of reality. Radahn was her male aspect, her other half, a champion of the Golden Order who fought to preserve everything Marika had built. When a single god produces children with itself, the result is catastrophic. The laws of nature rebel against such an impossibility, and so Miquella and his twin sister Malenia were born cursed, their divine heritage twisted into afflictions that would define their entire existence. Malenia was cursed with scarlet rot, a plague that consumed her from within, spreading decay and madness wherever it touched. Her body rotted slowly, inexorably, and she would eventually become the avatar of an outer god dedicated to nothing but corruption and death. But Miquella's curse was different, more subtle, and in some ways more terrible. He was cursed with eternal youth, his body frozen in childhood, never to grow, never to mature, never to become the adult he was meant to be. Imagine the horror of that existence. Your mind grows, your wisdom expands, your understanding deepens, but your body remains that of a child. You possess the intellect of a genius, the strategic mind of a master manipulator, the philosophical depth of a scholar, all trapped in a form that will never command respect, never inspire awe through physical presence alone. The demigods of the lands between were many, each vying for power after the shattering of the Elden Ring. There was Godwyn the Golden, the first of the demigods to die, whose death sparked the Night of Black Knives. There was Morgott and Mohg, the Omen twins, born with horns and marked as cursed, hidden away in shame. There was Radahn, the mighty general who learned gravity magic just so he could continue riding his beloved horse, despite his massive size. There was Ricard, who fed himself to a great serpent in pursuit of immortal power. And there was Ranni, who orchestrated Godwyn's death to free herself from the machinations of the Greater Will. Among all these powerful, ambitious, dangerous demigods, Miquella was considered the most fearsome, not because of his strength in battle, not because of his magical prowess, not because of armies or artifacts or ancient weapons. No, Miquella was feared because he possessed something far more dangerous than any of those things. Miquella had learned how to compel love. Think about that for a moment. In a world of gods and monsters where warriors could split mountains and sorcerers could bend reality, the most terrifying power was the ability to make someone love you, to reach into their mind, into their very soul, and rewrite their deepest feelings, to turn enemies into devoted followers, to transform skeptics into true believers, to make anyone who met him willing to die for his cause. This wasn't persuasion or charisma in the normal sense. This was something far more invasive, far more absolute. When Miquella wanted you to love him, you had no choice in the matter. From his earliest days, Miquella was brilliant beyond measure. While other children played with toys, Miquella was studying the fundamental nature of reality. While others learned basic sorceries, Miquella was inventing entirely new schools of magic. He threw himself into research with a desperate intensity, driven by a singular goal that consumed his every waking moment. He had to cure Malenia. His twin sister, his other half, was rotting away before his eyes, and he would not accept that fate. The Golden Order, the religious and philosophical system that governed the lands between, was built on something called the Golden Order fundamentalism. This was the study of the laws that governed reality, the principles that the Greater Will had used to shape the world. Radahn, Miquella's father self, was a devoted fundamentalist, believing that through understanding these principles one could find answers to any problem. Young Miquella studied fundamentalism intensely, devouring every text, mastering every principle, hoping to find within those golden laws some cure for his sister's affliction. But fundamentalism failed him. The Golden Order, for all its sophistication and power, had no answer for the Scarlet Rot. The outer god that had cursed, Malenia was beyond the reach of the Greater Will's laws, and so Miquella did something radical, something that would set him on a path toward either salvation or damnation. He abandoned the Golden Order. He turned his back on his father's philosophy and began to forge his own way, developing new magic, new techniques, new solutions that existed outside the established order. This was when Miquella created Unalloyed Gold. In a world where gold was always associated with the Greater Will and the Golden Order, Miquella invented a new kind of gold, pure and untainted by any outer god's influence. Unalloyed gold could resist divine interference, could hold back the meddling of cosmic entities, could create a space where mortal will could exist free from godly manipulation. It was revolutionary, a form of magic that could say no to gods themselves. With unalloyed gold, Miquella crafted needles, delicate instruments that could be inserted into a person's body to hold back the influence of outer gods. One of these needles was given to Malenia, and while it couldn't cure her scarlet rot, it could slow its progression, could give her years or decades she wouldn't have had otherwise. These needles would later become crucial to the events of the Shattering, capable of suppressing even the frenzied flame, perhaps the most terrible force in all the lands between. But Miquella's ambitions went far beyond merely treating symptoms. He wanted to cure the incurable, to achieve the impossible, and so he conceived of a plan so audacious it would require decades to implement. He would grow a new Erdtree, one not connected to the greater will, not tainted by the machinations of outer gods. This tree would be a haven for the persecuted, the cursed, the unwanted. And from this tree, Miquella hoped, would come the power to finally heal his sister and himself. The Empyrean of contradictions. Miquella was named an Empyrean, one of the rare beings chosen as potential vessels for the Elden Ring, possible successors to Queen Marika herself. There were only a handful of Empyreans in all the lands between, Marika herself, of course. Ranni, Miquella's half-sister, though she would eventually reject that destiny. Malenia, Miquella's twin, bound to the scarlet rot. And Miquella himself, the eternal child with power beyond imagining. Being an Empyrean meant Miquella had the potential to become a god in the truest sense. Not just a powerful being, not merely an immortal entity, but a true god capable of wielding the Elden Ring and reshaping the fundamental laws of reality. It meant that somewhere in the cosmic plans of the greater will and the two fingers who served it, there was a path for Miquella to ascend to godhood. But Miquella looked at the world Marika had created and saw only suffering. He saw the omen born with horns and cast into sewers like animals. He saw the misbegotten, chimeric creatures treated as slaves and beasts of burden. He saw the Albinaurics, artificial life forms created by humans and then persecuted for their origin. He saw a civilization built on cruelty, where the strong dominated the weak, where those marked as different were cast out or destroyed, where the Golden Order's light illuminated only those deemed worthy, while casting all others into shadow. Unlike his mother Marika, who maintained the status quo of oppression, Miquella dreamed of something better. He envisioned an age of compassion, a world where no one would be persecuted for their birth, where all beings could live in harmony, where suffering itself would be abolished. It was a beautiful dream, a noble vision, and it was this very nobility that made what Miquella would become so terrifying. You see, Miquella had power that most of his siblings lacked. His abilities went beyond mere physical strength or magical talent. Where Radahn was the mightiest warrior among the demigods, where Ranni was a master of sorcery, where Malenia was unmatched in combat, Miquella possessed something far more insidious. He could compel affection. He could make people love him whether they wanted to or not. The bewitching branch was one manifestation of this power. These were tree branches blessed with Miquella's incantations, capable of temporarily turning enemies into allies. When you struck someone with a bewitching branch, their allegiance would shift completely. They would fight by your side, defend you with their life, act as though you were their dearest companion. The effect would wear off eventually, lasting only a few minutes, but during that time, the person was completely under the influence of Miquella's charm. But the bewitching branches were just a pale shadow of what Miquella himself could do. When he spoke to someone, when he looked them in the eyes, when he embraced them, he could rewrite their very emotions. Not temporarily, not for a few minutes, but permanently. People who encountered Miquella would find themselves filled with devotion they couldn't explain, loyalty they couldn't resist, love they never chose to feel. They would rationalize it afterwards, telling themselves they followed him because his cause was just, because his vision was noble, because he was kind. But the truth was darker. They followed him because he had reached into their minds and changed what they felt. And here's what made this truly terrifying. Miquella seemed to genuinely believe his own propaganda. He saw himself as kind, as compassionate, as someone who only wanted to help. He viewed his power to compel love as a tool for creating the gentle world he envisioned. In his mind, free will was the source of all suffering. If people could choose to be cruel, to be selfish, to harm one another, then cruelty and harm would continue. But if everyone loved each other, if everyone was compassionate, if everyone worked together in harmony, then suffering would end. He couldn't see, or perhaps chose not to see, that love without choice isn't love at all. That compassion enforced by magic is just another form of tyranny. That a world where everyone is compelled to care for one another is a world where no one truly cares for anything, where genuine emotion has been replaced by programmed response, where the very essence of what makes us thinking, feeling beings has been stripped away. Miquella's followers truly loved him. Malenia, his twin sister, became his blade, his protector, devoting her entire existence to his service. She was Malenia, Blade of Miquella, before she was anything else. Her identity was so bound up in her devotion to her brother that even in the depths of madness, even as the scarlet rot consumed her mind and body, even as she waited alone at the base of the Haligtree for a brother who would never return, she still proclaimed that devotion. "I am Malenia, Blade of Miquella," she would say, and in those words was everything. Love and duty and identity all rolled into one. The Cleanroll Knights followed Miquella with the same fervour. These were elite warriors who stayed by Malenia's side even as the scarlet rot consumed them, even as their own bodies began to decay and corrupt. They wore golden armour lined with unalloyed gold to slow the rot's progression, but they knew they were dying, and they stayed anyway, because Miquella and Malenia were worth dying for, or at least that's what they believed. Had Miquella charmed them too? Had their devotion been a choice, or had it been implanted? The question haunted everyone who learned the truth about Miquella's power. Could any of his followers be said to truly follow him? Or were they all victims of his ability, puppets dancing on strings of compelled affection, their free will stolen in the name of creating a gentler world? St. Trina, the severed self. But there was another side to Miquella, literally another aspect of his being that few in the lands between understood. Just as his parents Marika and Radahn were two halves of a single god, Miquella too possessed a dual nature. His other half was known as St. Trina, and the story of their relationship is one of the saddest and most disturbing elements of Miquella's tale. St. Trina was associated with sleep and dreams. In the lands between, she was known as a gentle deity who could grant peaceful slumber to those who suffered. Her followers would drink a special nectar that induced deep, restful sleep, offering escape from the harsh realities of their lives. To many, St. Trina was a saviour, someone who brought mercy in the form of oblivion, who could quiet troubled minds and ease painful memories. The connection between St. Trina and Miquella was hinted at throughout the lands between. Both were associated with lilies, delicate flowers that symbolised their respective followings. Miquella's lily was a golden flower that signified faith in the Haligtree. Trina's lily was pale purple and on the verge of wilting, used to craft items that induced sleep. Both lilies were exceedingly rare, both were precious to their followers, and both shared eerily similar descriptions in the ancient texts. The clean-rot knights who served Malenia could sometimes be found carrying St. Trina's lilies, suggesting a connection between Miquella and the mysterious saint. The Albinoric archers who guarded the secret paths to the Haligtree wore armour decorated with lily motifs and could drop St. Trina's arrows. Even the bewitching branches, blessed with Miquella's unalloyed gold, had their crafting recipe contained in a cookbook penned by a devotee of St. Trina. St. Trina was described in contradictory terms by different sources. Some said she was a comely young girl, others insisted he was a boy. The confusion made sense once you understood the truth. St. Trina wasn't a separate person. She was Miquella's other self, another facet of his being, just as Radahn was to Marika. And like Miquella, St. Trina appeared eternally young, childlike, gender ambiguous, in that way that children often are before puberty truly sets in. Where Miquella represented ambition and action, grand plans for reshaping the world, St. Trina represented something softer. She was the part of Miquella that could love without agenda, that could offer comfort without expecting anything in return, that wanted to ease suffering simply because suffering was terrible. She was gentleness without the need to control, compassion without the impulse to force everyone into harmony. In many ways, St. Trina was the best part of Miquella. She was the love he felt for his sister, the genuine desire to help the persecuted, the kindness that motivated his grandest ambitions. She was his conscience, his heart, the part of him that made his vision of a gentler world something more than empty rhetoric, and Miquella abandoned her. When Miquella entered the realm of shadow to pursue godhood, he began a process of shedding parts of himself. This wasn't metaphorical. He was literally divesting himself of aspects of his being, leaving them behind like a snake shedding its skin. Throughout the land of shadow, travellers could find crosses marking the sites where Miquella had abandoned pieces of himself. His doubt and vacillation at one cross, his fears at another, his flesh, his golden lineage, the very essence of what made him an Empyrean. And at a cross near the stone coffin fissure, there was an inscription that read, "I abandon here my love." Below that cross, deep in a cavern filled with purple flowers and poisonous mist, St. Trina lay dying. She had taken physical form, or perhaps this was her ghost, her discarded essence given shape by the flowers that had always been her symbol. She appeared as a beautiful figure cradled within a massive purple blossom, her skin tinged with the same colour, her form delicate and fading. And she was conscious. She could still think, still feel, still understand what had been done to her. When travellers found her and drank her nectar 4 times as tradition demanded, she would speak to them in whispers, and what she told them was heartbreaking. Godhood would be Miquella's prison, she said. A caged divinity is beyond saving. St. Trina, the loving half of Miquella, the part of him that genuinely cared for others, understood what her other self could not or would not see. In his quest to become a god and create an age of compassion, Miquella was destroying everything that had made that vision noble in the first place. He was cutting away his capacity for love, for doubt, for fear, for all the human emotions that made compassion meaningful. What would be left when he finally ascended? A god of compassion who could no longer feel true compassion, a deity of love who had abandoned love itself. St. Trina begged travellers to kill Miquella, not out of anger or revenge, but out of love. She wanted to save him from himself. to prevent him from becoming the hollow god he was determined to become. It was the ultimate act of compassion from the being who represented all of Miquella's capacity for compassion. She would rather see him dead than see him transformed into a monster wearing kindness as a mask. And there, in that purple garden deep beneath the earth, St. Trina slowly died. When Miquella was finally defeated, when his plans for godhood were thwarted, travellers who returned to her resting place would find only a helmet in the shape of a flower, St. Trina's blossom, lying on the ground where her form had been. She was gone, fully and finally severed from the being who had once been her other half. The tragedy of St. Trina reveals the fundamental corruption at the heart of Miquella's plan. He couldn't create an age of compassion because he had thrown away his own compassion to get there. He couldn't make the world gentler because he had excised the gentle parts of himself. He wanted to heal all wounds, but had cut away the part of himself that understood why wounds hurt. In trying to become the perfect god, he had made himself into the perfect tyrant. The Haligtree and broken dreams. Before all of this, before the journey into shadow and the abandonment of his better self, Miquella had another dream. This one was more tangible, more immediate. He would grow a new Erdtree, one that existed outside the influence of the Greater Will and the Golden Order. It would be a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to turn, a symbol of hope for the hopeless. He called it the Haligtree. The location Miquella chose for his project was far from the Erdtree's reach, hidden in the frozen peaks of the consecrated snowfield. To even find the path to the Haligtree required possessing a secret medallion, split into two halves and hidden in different locations across the lands between. One half was in Castle Saul, a fortress in the mountain tops of the Giants. The other was held by Latena, an Albinoric woman who had devoted herself to Miquella's cause. Only by bringing both halves to the Grand Lift of Rold could one access the secret path to the consecrated snowfield. The Haligtree grew from a sapling that Miquella watered with his own blood. This was no mere metaphor. He literally bled for his dream, infusing the young tree with his divine essence, hoping that his godly blood could give birth to something new and pure. The tree grew massive and beautiful, its golden leaves shining with an inner light, its trunk strong enough to support an entire fortress built into its branches. Around and within the Haligtree, Miquella built Elphael, a city that would serve as the seat of his power and a refuge for the persecuted. The architecture was breathtaking golden stonework and graceful arches, walkways suspended high above the ground, elegant towers reaching toward the sky. It was a vision of what civilization could be at its best, a place where beauty and function merged into something transcendent. And to the Haligtree came the unwanted, the cursed, the persecuted. The Albinorics, those artificial beings created by human hands and then cast out by human cruelty, found sanctuary here. They served as archers and guards, defending their haven with fierce devotion. The misbegotten, chimeric creatures born with animal features and treated as monsters by the Golden Order were welcomed. Even the Oracle envoys, strange beings who served the Erdtree but had been cast aside, made their home in the Haligtree's branches. The clean-rot knights stood guard, their golden armour gleaming even as the rot consumed them from within. They knew they were dying, but they stayed at their posts, devoted to protecting this place that Miquella had created. The Haligtree knights, wearing helms crowned with golden wreaths, swore oaths of service that bound them unto death. They believed in what Miquella was building here, believed it was worth defending with their lives. Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree, was perhaps the most devoted of all. She had once served the Carian royal family, but she had abandoned that service when she learned of the Haligtree. She pledged herself to Miquella's cause and became the final guardian, standing watch at the entrance to Elphael itself. To reach Malenia and the heart of the Haligtree, one first had to defeat Loretta, and she fought with the skill and determination of someone who truly believed in what she protected. At the base of the Haligtree, in a chamber deep within Elphael's roots, Miquella entered a cocoon. This was how he would break his curse, how he would finally grow to adulthood and gain the power to heal Malenia. He would hibernate within this golden chrysalis, gestating, transforming, becoming something more than he had been. The Haligtree would nourish him with its roots, while he nourished it with his blood. It was a symbiotic relationship, god and tree growing together toward their shared destiny. But Miquella's plans required time, years, or even decades for the transformation to complete, and during that time, he was vulnerable. His cocoon was hidden, guarded by Malenia and the most loyal of his followers, but it was still a static target, and there were those in the lands between who would very much like to claim an Empyrean for their own purposes. Mohg, Lord of Blood, was one such person. Mohg was one of the Omen twins, born to Marika and Godfrey with horns and a bestial appearance. He and his twin Morgott had been hidden away in shame beneath Lindel, imprisoned in the sewers because their very existence was an embarrassment to the Golden Order. But where Morgott remained loyal to the Golden Order, despite how it had treated him, Mohg embraced his cursed nature. He made contact with an outer god called the Formless Mother, a deity of blood and wounds, and founded his own dynasty dedicated to blood magic and dark rituals. Mohg wanted to create his own age, a Mohgwyn dynasty that would replace the Golden Order. But to become a true god, he needed an Empyrean consort, someone who could help him access the Elden Ring and reshape reality. And Miquella, trapped in his cocoon, unable to resist, was the perfect target. Or so it seemed. What Mohg didn't know, what no one outside the Land of Shadow would learn until much later, was that his kidnapping of Miquella was no kidnapping at all. It was planned, orchestrated. Miquella had used his power to charm Mohg, to place him under the same compelled affection that had claimed so many others. Mohg thought his desire to possess Miquella came from his own ambitions, thought his plans for the Mohgwyn dynasty were his own schemes, but they weren't. He was a puppet, and Miquella was pulling the strings. Why would Miquella arrange his own abduction? Because he needed access to the Land of Shadow, the place where Queen Marika had once performed the rites to ascend to godhood. The Land of Shadow existed in a separate realm, sealed away by Marika herself, accessible only through very specific means. And one of those means was through Mohg, through the blood rituals he performed, through the connection his dynasty had to the space between worlds. When Mohg's followers dragged Miquella's cocoon from the Haligtree, they thought they were stealing a prize. They brought it to Mohgwyn Palace, Mohg's fortress hidden deep underground, and there Mohg began his rituals. He would share his blood with Miquella, would bind them together, would force the Empyrean to become his consort and help him ascend to godhood. But Miquella never responded. No matter how much blood Mohg poured into the cocoon, no matter how many rituals he performed, Miquella remained silent and still. Mohg's followers grew increasingly desperate. Their lord was obsessed with this unresponsive figure, wasting resources and time on rituals that seemed to accomplish nothing. Sir Ansbach, one of Mohg's most loyal knights, eventually recognized what was happening. He saw that Miquella had charmed his lord, that Mohg was being manipulated. Ansbach tried to free Mohg from the enchantment, tried to break the spell that held his master in thrall. But when he confronted Miquella, when he came face to face with the slumbering Empyrean, Ansbach himself fell under the charm. Despite knowing what Miquella's power could do, despite preparing himself to resist, Ansbach found himself filled with devotion to the very being he had come to fight. While Mohg performed his rituals, the Haligtree began to die. Without Miquella's blood to nourish it, without his presence at its heart, the great tree began to wither. The scarlet rot, which Malenia had been holding back through sheer force of will, and the unalloyed gold needle her brother had crafted began to spread unchecked. She had returned to the Haligtree after her battle with Radahn, infected with rot, half dead from the confrontation. Without Miquella there to help her, without his treatments and his research, the rot consumed her and began to consume the tree itself. The Cleanrot Knights rotted faster without Miquella's magic to slow the process. The Albinorics and Misbegotten who had found sanctuary here watched their home decay around them. The golden leaves turned brown and fell. The branches grew brittle and weak, and at the base of the tree, Malenia stood guard over an empty chamber, still waiting for a brother who would never return, still proclaiming herself the blade of Miquella, even as both she and the tree rotted away. It was a tragedy of epic proportions. Everything Miquella had built, all the hope he had given to the hopeless, all the sanctuary he had provided to the persecuted, it was all crumbling away. And he had arranged it himself, had sacrificed it all as part of his grand plan to ascend to godhood. The Haligtree, which should have been his greatest achievement, became his greatest betrayal. He had abandoned everyone who had believed in him, left them to rot and die, all in pursuit of power, the power to compel love. Let's talk more deeply about what it means that Miquella could compel love, because this is the aspect of his character that makes him truly terrifying, more frightening than any monster or demon in the lands between. This is psychological horror at its finest, the violation of the one thing that should be absolutely sacred and inviolable. Your own mind, your own feelings, your own choices. When someone falls in love naturally, it's a complicated process. Chemistry and circumstance, shared experiences and compatible personalities, the mysterious alchemy that draws two souls together. It can be wonderful or terrible, fulfilling or devastating, but it's yours, your love, your choice, your feeling. Even when love is painful, even when it's unrequited or destructive, there's something fundamentally human about the fact that you chose to feel it. But Miquella could take that away. When he used his power on someone, he reached into the deepest parts of their psyche and rewrote their emotional responses. He didn't just make people like him or admire him, he made them love him with an intensity that overrode everything else in their lives. Their own goals became secondary to serving him. Their own desires paled compared to the desire to please him. Their own identity became wrapped up in their devotion to him. The bewitching branch offered a glimpse of how this power worked. When you used one of these branches on an enemy, their hostility would vanish instantly. A soldier who moments ago was trying to kill you would suddenly fight by your side, defending you as though you were their dearest companion. An aggressive creature that had been attacking on sight would become docile and protective. The effect was total and immediate, overriding instinct and training and previous loyalties with absolute authority. But the bewitching branch was just a tool, an imperfect copy of Miquella's true power. The branches wore off after a few minutes. Miquella's personal charm was permanent. When he looked someone in the eyes and spoke to them, when he embraced them with his arms, thin and childlike but possessing a strength that wasn't physical, he could rewrite them permanently. They would never be the same person again. Part of who they were would be overwritten with devotion to Miquella, and they would never get it back. Consider Mohg's case. He was a powerful demigod, someone with his own ambitions and goals. He had suffered greatly under the Golden Order, been imprisoned and reviled for circumstances of his birth he couldn't control. He had found power in the Formless Mother, built his own dynasty, carved out his own place in the world. He was independent, strong-willed, dangerous. And Miquella turned him into a puppet with apparently little effort. Mohg genuinely believed he was in control. He thought he was the one doing the abducting, that claiming Miquella was his brilliant plan. He performed his blood rituals with sincere conviction, truly believing that sharing his blood with Miquella would create the bond he needed for godhood. He couldn't see that every action he took, every ritual he performed, every drop of blood he spilled was exactly what Miquella wanted him to do. The charm was so complete that Mohg's mind created rationalizations for feelings that weren't his own, turned compelled devotion into what seemed like logical ambition. Sir Ansbach saw through it, but even that knowledge couldn't save him. When he confronted Miquella to break the charm on Mohg, Ansbach was prepared. He knew what Miquella could do. He had steeled himself against it, fortified his will, approached with every mental defense he could muster. And it didn't matter. The moment Miquella's power touched him, Ansbach fell just like everyone else. His devotion to Mohg, which had been strong enough to make him attempt this intervention in the first place, was instantly replaced with devotion to Miquella. And like Mohg, Ansbach couldn't see what had been done to him. He rationalized his new loyalty, told himself it was justified, convinced himself that Miquella's cause was worth serving. This is what made Miquella terrifying. There was no defense against his power. Strength of will didn't matter. Prior loyalties didn't matter. Knowing what he could do didn't matter. If Miquella wanted you to love him, you would love him, and you would believe that love was your choice. Think about Malenia. She was Miquella's twin, born in the same cursed birth, his companion from the very beginning. They had grown up together, suffered together, survived their afflictions through mutual support. Was her devotion to him genuine? Or had he charmed her too, perhaps when they were still children, establishing absolute loyalty that would never waver? There's no way to know. Even Malenia herself couldn't know. If Miquella had compelled her love, she would never be aware of it. She would feel her devotion as genuine, would be willing to die for him, would proclaim herself his blade with absolute sincerity, never realizing her very capacity to feel otherwise had been stripped away. The philosophical implications of this power are staggering. In a sense, Miquella committed a form of murder every time he used his charm. He killed the person who existed before, the person with their own feelings and choices, and replaced them with someone who would love him. The body remained, the memories remained, the skills and knowledge remained, but the core of who they were, their autonomy, their ability to feel things that weren't programmed into them, that was gone. And Miquella saw this as kindness. He genuinely believed that by making people love him, by compelling them to work together in harmony, he was saving them from themselves. In his vision, free will was the root of all suffering. People chose to be cruel, chose to hate, chose to harm each other. If everyone loved everyone else, if everyone worked toward common goals, if everyone cared about each other's well-being, then all that suffering would end. What he couldn't or wouldn't see was that love without choice is not love at all. It's programming, it's mind control, it's the reduction of thinking, feeling beings into automatons who happen to have emotions. But those emotions are no more real or meaningful than the behavioral responses of a well-trained dog. A dog that's been conditioned to love its master might seem happy, might act devotedly, but we don't pretend that love is the same as the love between two humans who choose to care for each other. Miquella wanted to create a world where everyone loved everyone else, but in doing so, he would create a world where no one truly loved anything, where genuine emotion had been replaced by universal programming, where every smile was hollow, where every act of kindness was compelled rather than chosen. It would be a world of puppets pretending to be people. And the most horrible part was that the puppets wouldn't even know they were puppets. They would live out their lives believing their feelings were real, never understanding that the most fundamental part of their humanity had been stolen. This is why Saint Trina begged for Miquella to be killed. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what he was becoming. She was the part of him that could love genuinely, that could feel compassion without needing to control. And she saw that Miquella's path would lead to the destruction of real love, real compassion, real connection between thinking beings. Better for him to die than to succeed in creating his age of compassion, which would be an age of the death of everything that made compassion meaningful. If you've enjoyed this journey through Miquella's story so far, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button. It helps other people find these videos and settle in for the night. And if you want more lore stories like this, deep dives into the terrifying tales of the lands between, consider subscribing. There's so much more to explore in this world. The grand manipulation. As we piece together Miquella's actions, we begin to see just how extensive his manipulation truly was. He wasn't just charming individuals on a whim. He was orchestrating events on a massive scale, pulling strings across decades, arranging circumstances with the precision of a master chess player who could see thousands of moves ahead. The abduction by Mohg, as we've discussed, was no abduction at all. Miquella had charmed Mohg specifically for this purpose, turning him into an unwitting accomplice in his plans. But that was just one piece of a much larger scheme. The true extent of Miquella's manipulation becomes clear only when we examine what happened in the Land of Shadow and what he had planned for Radahn. To understand this, we need to talk about Radahn. Star Scourge Radahn, the mightiest warrior among the demigods, who learned gravity magic so he could keep riding his beloved horse Leonard despite his massive size. Radahn who held back the very stars themselves, preventing fate itself from progressing. Radahn who fought Malenia to a standstill in a battle that ended with both of them effectively destroyed. Radahn and Miquella had known each other as children, in the time before the Shattering, when the demigods were still something resembling a family. Miquella and Radahn had apparently been close, and at some point during their youth, they had made a vow. The exact words of this vow were lost to time, but the essence was clear. Radahn had promised Miquella something, agreed to some compact that would bind them together in Miquella's plans for ascension. What could compel the mighty Radahn to make such a vow? Perhaps Miquella's charm used subtly over years of friendship, perhaps genuine affection between the young demigods before ambition and war drove them apart. Or perhaps Radahn had agreed willingly, not understanding what Miquella would ultimately ask of him. We may never know the truth of how the vow was established, but we know that Miquella intended to hold Radahn to it. The plan was elegant in its brutality. To become a god, Miquella needed to pass through the gate of divinity in the land of shadow, the same gate his mother Marika had used to ascend. But passage through that gate required a specific condition. Miquella needed a consort, a powerful lord who would serve as his vessel and partner in godhood, and Miquella had chosen Radahn for this role. There was just one problem. Radahn was, by all accounts, a loyal son of the Golden Order. He revered Radahn and was devoted to the system his father had helped build. He would never willingly join Miquella in creating a new age that would overturn everything Radahn believed in. The Radahn who existed in the present day would refuse Miquella's call, so Miquella arranged for Radahn to die. Not permanently, because he would need Radahn later. But Radahn needed to be reduced to something manageable, something that could be reshaped and reborn in a form more useful to Miquella's purposes, and the tool Miquella chose for this task was his own sister, Malenia. The battle between Malenia and Radahn is legendary in the lands between. It took place in Caelid, a region that would be forever scarred by what happened there. The two mightiest warriors among the demigods met in combat, and the battle raged for hours, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Radahn's raw strength and gravity magic clashed against Malenia's legendary skill and relentless offense. The Cleanrot Knights fought Radahn's red manes. The ground trembled. The sky itself seemed to shake with the force of their conflict. And then Malenia did something she had never done before. She bloomed. This was the true horror of the Scarlet Rot, the ultimate expression of the curse that plagued her. When pushed to her absolute limit, Malenia could unleash the rot in an explosion of divine power, a flower of decay that would consume everything around her. She had resisted this power her entire life, had used Miquella's needle to suppress it, had fought against the impulse to let the rot free. But in Caelid, facing an enemy she couldn't defeat through skill alone, she gave in. The bloom was catastrophic. The scarlet rot spread across Caelid like a plague, rotting the land itself, transforming lush fields into a festering swamp, poisoning the water, killing or mutating every living thing it touched. Radahn's soldiers died screaming, their bodies consumed by corruption. The local wildlife twisted into horrible mockeries of what they had been. The very ground turned red and sick, and it would remain that way forever. Radahn was infected with the rot, the disease eating at his mind and body. But he didn't die. He was too strong for that, too stubborn to let something like terminal illness stop him. But his mind was gone, consumed by the rot and the madness it brought. He forgot who he was, forgot his duty, forgot everything except an endless hunger. He roamed Caelid on his tiny horse Leonard, the gravity magic that once let him ride now keeping him from crushing his beloved steed, attacking anything that came near him, a mindless beast wearing the body of a once great general. Malenia barely survived. She was carried back to the Haligtree by her knights, more dead than alive, the rot having consumed even more of her body than before. She would remain at the base of the Haligtree, standing guard over the empty chamber where Miquella's cocoon had been, waiting for a brother who would never return. Had Miquella known this would happen? Had he sent Malenia to fight Radahn, understanding that it would destroy her? The evidence suggests yes. This was all part of his plan. Radahn needed to be reduced to this state, his mind destroyed, his power spent, his body rotting but alive. This was the condition Miquella required for what would come next, because a Radahn with his mind intact would never agree to be Miquella's consort, but a Radahn whose mind was gone, whose soul had been fragmented by madness and death, whose body was being eaten by rot, that Radahn could be reshaped, that Radahn could be resurrected in a new form, with a new purpose, bound to Miquella's will by more than just an ancient vow. Years later, when Miquella made his move, when he allowed himself to be taken by Mohg and transported to the Land of Shadow, he brought Radahn with him. Not Radahn's rotting body in Caelid, but Radahn's soul, his essence, everything that had once made him the Star Scourge. And Miquella poured that soul into a new vessel, Mohg's body. This was the ultimate violation. Mohg, who thought he was ascending to godhood, who believed he was making Miquella his consort, was actually being prepared as a vessel for someone else. Miquella needed a body for Radahn's soul, and Mohg's body, powerful and infused with the strength of the formless mother, would serve perfectly. When the time came, when all the pieces were in place, Miquella would perform the resurrection, binding Radahn's soul to Mohg's body and creating his promised consort. The cruelty of this plan is staggering. Miquella used his sister as a weapon, sending her to a battle that would destroy her and leave her rotting at the base of their dream project. He manipulated Mohg for years, charming him into obsession, using him as both transportation and eventually as a body to be puppeted by another soul. He condemned Radahn to years of mindless agony, his once proud spirit trapped in a rotting body, wandering Caelid as a mad beast. And all of this was just preparation, just the setup for Miquella's true goal, journey through shadow. The Land of Shadow was a place sealed away by Queen Marika herself. It existed alongside the lands between but separate from it, hidden behind a veil that only specific rituals could penetrate. This was where Marika had walked the path to godhood, where she had sacrificed and suffered and ultimately ascended to become the vessel of the Elden Ring. And this was where Miquella needed to go to achieve the same transformation. When Mohg's rituals finally opened the way, Miquella's cocoon was transported from Mohgwyn Palace into the Land of Shadow, and there Miquella emerged. Not as the adult he had hoped to become through his hibernation in the Haligtree, but still in his childlike form, still cursed with eternal youth. But he was active now, mobile, capable of pursuing his goals directly. What followed was a pilgrimage unlike any other. Miquella travelled across the land of shadow, but he didn't just journey physically. He was divesting himself of pieces of his being, deliberately discarding aspects of himself that he deemed unnecessary or impediments to godhood. At various locations he erected crosses to mark these abandonments, permanent monuments to what he had given up. The first cross marked where he abandoned his doubt and vacillation. Miquella had always questioned himself, had second-guessed his plans, had worried about whether he was doing the right thing. That uncertainty was part of what made him thoughtful, what made him consider the consequences of his actions. But in his mind, a god couldn't afford doubt. A god needed to be certain, needed to act decisively without hesitation. So he cut away his capacity for uncertainty and left it behind. Another cross marked where he abandoned his fears. All thinking beings feel fear. It's what keeps us cautious, what makes us evaluate risk, what prevents us from taking actions that might destroy us. Miquella saw fear as weakness, as something that would hold him back from doing what needed to be done, so he discarded it, along with all the wisdom that healthy fear provides. He abandoned his sense of self, the golden lineage that connected him to Marika and Radahn, the very essence of what made him an Empyrean. This was his divine heritage, the power that flowed through his veins, the potential that marked him as a possible vessel for the Elden Ring. In giving this up, he was severing his connection to the greater will and the Golden Order completely. He would become a new kind of god, independent of the powers that had shaped the lands between. He abandoned his flesh itself. What this meant exactly is unclear, but it represented another step in his transformation from physical being to something more abstract, more purely conceptual. He was shedding his humanity piece by piece, becoming less a person and more an idea, less an individual and more a force. And finally, at the cross near Stone Coffin Fissure, he abandoned his love. St. Trina, his better half, the part of him capable of genuine compassion, was discarded like everything else. This was perhaps the most crucial abandonment. Love was what had motivated him, what had made his vision of a gentler world something more than empty rhetoric. Without it, what would remain? Each abandonment was permanent. Miquella couldn't reclaim what he had discarded. These weren't temporary sacrifices that he could take back once he achieved godhood. These were amputations of his very soul, cutting away parts of himself that could never be restored. With each cross, he became less himself and more a hollow vessel for the age of compassion he sought to create. An age of compassion presided over by a god who had thrown away his capacity to feel compassion. An age of gentleness created by someone who had discarded his gentle nature. An age of love enforced by someone who had abandoned love itself. The journey through shadow was also marked by Miquella's growing following. People who encountered him fell under his charm and joined his cause. Sir Ansbach, despite knowing what Miquella's power could do, became devoted to him. Moore, an albinoric warrior with dreams of becoming a knight, pledged himself to Miquella's service. Haunsant warriors seeking revenge against those who had persecuted their people in the Great Hunts found in Miquella someone who promised justice and inclusion. But these followers were just more puppets, more tools to be used in Miquella's grand plan. He charmed them, not because he cared about them as individuals, but because he needed an army, needed supporters who would fight for him when the time came. Their devotion was programmed, their loyalty manufactured, their belief in his cause implanted rather than earned. Teolia was perhaps the saddest case among Miquella's followers. He had been a devoted follower of St. Trina, drinking her nectar to escape the pain of his existence, finding comfort in the dream she brought. But when he encountered Miquella in the Land of Shadow, he fell under the charm like everyone else. His devotion transferred instantly from St. Trina to Miquella, never knowing that he had just pledged himself to the being who had murdered his previous object of worship. When travellers told Teolia what had become of St. Trina, he was devastated. His faith was shaken but not broken, because the charm was too strong. Even knowing what Miquella had done, Teolia couldn't break free of his compelled devotion. Throughout his journey, Miquella moved toward his ultimate destination, the Gate of Divinity at Anir Ilim, the place where gods were made. He was retracing his mother's footsteps, following the path Marika had walked centuries before. But where Marika had walked this path to free her people from oppression, had sacrificed parts of herself out of necessity and grief, Miquella was doing it purely to gain power. He wanted to become a god not to end suffering but to control it, to create a world where no one could choose to cause suffering because he had taken away their ability to choose anything he didn't approve of. The vow with Radahn. As Miquella approached the Gate of Divinity, the time came to fulfill the ancient vow Radahn had made. Through rituals we can only guess at, through magic that bent the rules of life and death, Miquella resurrected the Star Scourge. But this wasn't the Radahn who had held back the stars, who had learned gravity magic out of love for his horse, who had been a loyal son of the Golden Order. This was Radahn remade, his soul bound to Mohg's body, his will subsumed into Miquella's vision. The resurrection happened at the Divine Gate in Anir Ilim, the floating capital of the Land of Shadow. This was the place where Marika had ascended, where the power to reshape reality could be claimed by those strong enough to reach it. And it was here that Miquella performed his final preparations for godhood. Radahn's soul, which had been fragmented by madness and death, was reconstituted and poured into Mohg's corpse. The body of the Lord of Blood became the vessel for the Star Scourge's essence. What emerged was something that was neither quite Radahn nor quite Mohg, but a hybrid creature that served Miquella's needs perfectly. It had Radahn's power and martial skill, Mohg's physical form and connection to outer powers, and absolute loyalty to Miquella burned into its very existence. This was the Promised Consort Radahn, a title that seemed romantic but was actually horrifying. Radahn hadn't promised himself willingly as an adult making an informed choice. He had been manipulated as a child, destroyed as an adult, and resurrected as a puppet. The vow that bound them wasn't sacred. It was a chain Miquella had forged to enslave one of the mightiest demigods to his will. When travellers finally reached the Divine Gate, when they fought their way through Miquella's army of charmed followers and reached the threshold of godhood, they found Miquella standing before the gate with Radahn at his side. And in that moment, Miquella made his final transformation. He passed through the gate and became a god, not in the traditional sense of ascending to serve the greater will, but as an independent deity with the power to remake the fundamental laws of reality. Miquella the Kind became Miquella, god of the New Age, and his first act as a god was to face down the travellers who had come to stop him with his Promised Consort as his weapon. The battle that followed was legendary. Radahn fought with the strength that had once made him the most feared warrior among the demigods, enhanced by Mohg's blood magic and guided by Miquella's will. He wielded two massive swords instead of his original greatswords, fighting with brutal efficiency that showed no trace of the honor that had once defined him. This wasn't Radahn fighting, it was Radahn's power being wielded by Miquella's will, a flesh puppet dancing on divine strings, and Miquella himself fought alongside Radahn, no longer the helpless child he had appeared to be. As a god, he wielded powers that could devastate with a gesture, holy magic that could punish and purify, the ability to compel not just love but absolute obedience. Throughout the battle, Miquella attempted to charm the travellers who fought him, to bring them under his control and add them to his collection of devoted followers. Every attack from Miquella carried not just physical danger, but the threat of mental violation, of having your very identity rewritten to serve his age of compassion. Radahn's moveset in this final form was terrifying. He combined his gravity magic with new abilities drawn from Mohg's blood powers, creating devastating combinations that could crush enemies or drain their life force. He could summon meteors from above, create gravitational wells that pulled fighters toward him, execute spinning attacks that covered massive areas. And through it all, Miquella rode on his back or floated beside him, the child god directing his consort like a general commanding his ultimate weapon. Some who fought Miquella felt his charm working on them during the battle. They felt an inexplicable fondness growing, an urge to lay down their weapons and embrace this beautiful child god who only wanted the best for everyone. It took tremendous willpower to resist, to remember why they had come here, to hold on to their identity in the face of power that could rewrite who they were. The mental battle was as exhausting as the physical one, a constant struggle not just to survive but to remain yourself. When Radahn fell in the battle, something heartbreaking happened. For just a moment, Radahn's true consciousness seemed to surface. The confusion in his movements, the way he reached toward the sky as if remembering the stars he once held back, suggested that some small part of the real Radahn was still trapped inside this resurrected shell. And then he died again, this time perhaps for good, finally released from the prison Miquella had made of his soul. Age of compassion or tyranny? Let's take a moment to consider what Miquella's age of compassion would actually look like if he succeeded in establishing it. Because I think this is where the true horror of his character becomes most apparent. His vision sounds beautiful in the abstract. A world without cruelty, where everyone cares for everyone else, where the persecuted find sanctuary and suffering is abolished. Who wouldn't want to live in such a world? But the reality would be nightmarish. Miquella's age of compassion would be an age of absolute thought control, where every person in the lands between would be under his charm, their capacity for independent thought stripped away. They would all love each other not because they chose to, but because they had been programmed to. They would all work together in harmony not because they wanted to, but because Miquella had removed their ability to want anything else. Imagine waking up one day to find that you couldn't feel anger anymore, no matter how justified. Someone harms you or your loved ones, and you can only respond with compassion because Miquella has decided that anger leads to suffering. You want to feel rage at injustice, but that part of you has been cut away, replaced with gentle acceptance of whatever happens. Imagine finding that you couldn't disagree with anyone, couldn't argue for what you believe in, couldn't hold opinions different from the consensus. Because disagreement creates conflict, and conflict creates suffering, and suffering must be abolished. So everyone would think the same thoughts, hold the same beliefs, react in the same ways. Diversity of opinion would be impossible. Independent thought would be a violation of the age of compassion. Imagine having no privacy in your own mind. Miquella could reach into your thoughts at any time, could adjust your feelings to better serve his vision, could rewrite your very identity if he decided you weren't compassionate enough. There would be no inner life, no secret thoughts, no part of yourself that was truly your own. Everything you felt would be subject to revision by the God who decided that controlling people's emotions was the path to peace. This is what makes Miquella more terrifying than any other villain in Elden Ring. Mohg was cruel, but his cruelty was obvious. You knew where you stood with Mohg. He wanted power and didn't care who he hurt to get it. Rykard fed himself to a serpent and devoured his followers, but at least his evil was transparent. The frenzied flame wanted to burn everything to ash, but that horror was impossible to mistake for anything else. Miquella was different. Miquella genuinely believed he was good. He thought his charm was a gift, that taking away people's ability to choose cruelty was the same as choosing kindness on their behalf. He looked at a world full of suffering and decided that the problem was free will, that thinking beings couldn't be trusted to make good choices, so he would make those choices for them. And because he was charming, because he appeared innocent and childlike, because he spoke in terms of compassion and gentleness, it was easy to miss just how monstrous his vision actually was. People who fell under his charm never recognized what had been done to them. They thought their love for Miquella was genuine, thought their devotion was freely given, never understanding that the very capacity to feel otherwise had been stolen from them. This is tyranny, dressed in the language of liberation. This is slavery that calls itself freedom. This is the death of everything that makes us human, wrapped in beautiful rhetoric about ending suffering. And the worst part is that Miquella's victims would never know they were victims. They would live out their lives believing themselves happy, believing themselves compassionate, believing themselves free, never understanding that they were nothing more than puppets dancing on strings they couldn't see. Marika, for all her flaws, had at least allowed people to live their own lives within the bounds of the Golden Order. The system was oppressive, certainly. The Omen were persecuted, the misbegotten enslaved, the Albinorics cast out. But individuals within that system could still think their own thoughts, feel their own feelings, make their own choices within the constraints imposed upon them. Marika controlled society but left minds free. Miquella wanted to control everything, not just society, not just laws and customs and social structures, but the very thoughts and feelings of every person in the world. Under his age of compassion, there would be no society because society requires individuals who can interact as autonomous beings. There would only be extensions of Miquella's will, puppets who thought themselves people, a world of hollow shells pretending to feel emotions they no longer had the capacity to genuinely experience. Consider what would happen in such a world when genuine problems arose. when crops failed, when disease spread, when natural disasters struck. People would need to respond, to organize, to make difficult decisions about resource allocation and priorities. But how could they make those decisions if everyone's thoughts were aligned to Miquella's will? Would they all simply agree on everything, moving in perfect unity like a hive mind? Or would Miquella himself need to intervene in every decision, to directly control every response, making him not just a god but a micromanager of every aspect of existence? Either way, it wouldn't be a world of thinking beings anymore. It would be a world of biological machines running programs written by Miquella, going through the motions of life without any of the messy vitality that makes life worth living. They would smile, but the smiles would be empty. They would love, but the love would be counterfeit. They would help each other, but only because they had been programmed to, not because they chose to care. The final confrontation and defeat. When travelers reached the Divine Gate and confronted Miquella, they weren't just fighting to prevent another god from ascending to power. They were fighting for something more fundamental, the right to be themselves, to feel their own feelings, to make their own choices, even if those choices led to suffering. They were fighting to preserve the very concept of individual identity against a god who wanted to dissolve all individuality into universal programmed compassion. The battle was desperate and brutal, testing not just physical skill but mental fortitude. Miquella's presence was overwhelming, his charm constantly pressing against the minds of those who fought him, whispering that resistance was unnecessary, that surrender would bring peace, that love was better than struggle. Some travelers reported hearing St. Trina's voice in their minds during the fight, her final gift to those who were to stop Miquella. She lent them strength to resist the charm, reminded them of who they were when the compulsion threatened to overwhelm them. Even in death, the loving half of Miquella was still trying to save him by helping those who would end his terrible plan. The fight required perfect execution. Radahn's attacks were devastating, capable of killing in single blows if the timing wasn't perfect. Miquella's holy magic scorched and burned, and his attempts at charming grew more desperate as the battle progressed. He couldn't understand why these travelers would resist him, why they would choose struggle and pain over the peace he offered. In his mind, their resistance proved they were broken, corrupted by the cruelty of the world, in need of his salvation more than anyone. But those who resisted, who held on to their identity in the face of Miquella's power, eventually prevailed. Through skill and determination and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender what made them themselves, they managed to defeat both Radahn and Miquella. The Promised Consort fell first, Mohg's body finally dying in service of a plan neither Mohg nor Radahn had ever truly consented to. The death of his consort seemed to shake Miquella, as if some part of him recognized the magnitude of what he had done, the lives he had destroyed in pursuit of his vision. And then Miquella himself was struck down. His godhood, still new and unestablished, couldn't protect him from those who refused to accept his age of compassion. As he fell, something changed in his expression. For just a moment he looked less like a god and more like a lost child, confused about why the world wouldn't accept the gift he was offering. Had he understood in those final moments what St. Trina had been trying to tell him? That godhood had indeed been his prison, that in cutting away everything human about himself he had become something monstrous? Or did he die still convinced of his righteousness, still believing that taking away everyone's ability to choose cruelty was the same as choosing kindness, never understanding the fundamental horror of what he had tried to create? With Miquella's death, his charm began to fade from those he had affected. It wasn't instant, and the process was painful. People who had been charmed needed to slowly rediscover who they had been before Miquella rewrote them. Some would never fully recover, the changes too deep, their original personalities too thoroughly overwritten. They would spend the rest of their lives unsure which thoughts were truly theirs and which had been implanted. Sir Anspark, if he survived the confrontation, would eventually realise what had been done to him. The loyal knight who had tried to free his lord from Miquella's charm would understand that he had failed, that he too had become a puppet, that his service to Miquella had been no more voluntary than Mohg's obsession. The knowledge would devastate him, but at least he would have his mind back, would once again be able to think thoughts that were truly his own. So why is Miquella the most terrifying god in Elden Ring? It's not because of his power, though he was certainly powerful. It's not because of what he did, though his actions were monstrous. It's because of the gap between what he claimed to be and what he actually was. It's because he genuinely believed he was good while doing things that were fundamentally evil. It's because he made tyranny look like kindness, made mental slavery look like liberation, made the death of individual identity look like universal compassion. Most villains in fiction are easy to recognize. They have obvious evil goals, use obviously evil methods, and often glory in their own wickedness. You can point to them and say, "That's the bad guy," without any difficulty. But Miquella wasn't like that. He was beautiful and gentle-seeming. He spoke in terms of ending suffering and creating a better world. He genuinely cared about the persecuted and wanted to give them sanctuary. If you listen to his words without examining his methods, he sounded like exactly the kind of leader the lands between needed. But his methods were monstrous. He built his entire plan on violating the autonomy of everyone around him, on reaching into their minds and rewriting who they were to serve his purposes. He sacrificed his sister, used Mohg as a disposable tool, destroyed Radahn's identity, and abandoned the best parts of himself, all in pursuit of a vision that would have turned every thinking being in the world into a puppet. And the truly terrifying thing is that he couldn't see anything wrong with this. In his mind, taking away people's ability to choose cruelty was identical to making them choose kindness. He couldn't understand that kindness that's compelled isn't kindness at all, that compassion enforced by mind control is just another form of violence, that love without choice is meaningless. This is what makes Miquella a perfect horror story. Not a monster that attacks from outside, but a corruption that wears a friendly face, that speaks in gentle tones, that promises to help you while destroying everything that makes you yourself. The horror of being told that your identity is the problem, that your ability to make your own choices is causing suffering, that you'll be happier once you surrender your will to someone who knows better than you what you should feel. It's the horror of the cult leader who isolates their followers from everyone else, who tells them that they're part of something special, who gradually rewrites their identity until they can't imagine existing outside the cult. It's the horror of abusive relationships where one partner gradually gains complete control over the other's thoughts and feelings, all while claiming it's for their own good. It's the horror of totalitarian regimes that claim to create perfect societies by eliminating dissent, that promise happiness through absolute control, and it's made worse by the fact that Miquella started from genuine compassion. He really did feel for the suffering of others. He really did want to help the persecuted. The Haligtree was a real sanctuary that saved real lives before he abandoned it. His research into unalloyed gold helped his sister and others resist the influence of malevolent outer gods. He wasn't born a monster. He became one gradually, making choices that seemed justifiable at the time, taking steps that appeared necessary for his larger goals, never quite realizing the moment when he crossed the line from savior to tyrant. This is how the worst evils happen in the real world too. Not through people who wake up one day and decide to be villains, but through people who convince themselves that the ends justify the means, that their good intentions excuse their terrible methods, that they have the right to control others for those others' own good. Miquella looked at suffering and decided the solution was to eliminate free will. He looked at cruelty and decided the solution was mind control. He looked at a world full of people making bad choices and decided the solution was to take away their ability to make any choices at all. And because he framed this in terms of compassion and kindness, because he spoke gently and seemed innocent, it was easy to miss just how monstrous that solution actually was. Compare him to the other major figures in Elden Ring. Ranni sought to create an age where gods wouldn't interfere in mortal lives, where people would have to navigate existence without divine guidance, but would be free to make their own mistakes. Her solution to the problem of oppressive gods was to remove gods from the equation entirely, to let people stumble through life making their own choices and living with the consequences. It was harsh, perhaps even cruel in its indifference, but it respected individual autonomy. The frenzied flame wanted to burn everything away, to reduce all existence to primordial chaos. It was horrifying, but at least it was honest about what it was. No one could mistake the frenzied flame for something benevolent. Its solution to suffering was obliteration, and it made no pretense otherwise. Even Marika, for all her flaws and cruelties, allowed her subjects to retain their own minds. The Golden Order was oppressive, certainly. It persecuted those it deemed impure, elevated some groups while casting others into shadow. But it didn't reach into people's heads and rewrite who they were. A person could live under the Golden Order while hating it, could plot rebellion, could dream of something different. They might be punished if they acted on those thoughts, but the thoughts themselves remained their own. Miquella's age of compassion would have been worse than any of these alternatives because it would have eliminated the very possibility of resistance or dissent. You couldn't hate Miquella's rule because he would have made you love it. You couldn't dream of something different because he would have made you content with what you had. You couldn't plot rebellion because the very capacity for discontent would have been erased from your mind. It would have been the end of change, the end of growth, the end of progress. Because all of those things require people who can look at the world and say, "This isn't good enough. We can do better." But in Miquella's world, everyone would already believe things were perfect because he had made them believe it. The world would be frozen in whatever state Miquella deemed ideal, with no possibility of evolution or improvement, because the drive to change things comes from dissatisfaction, and dissatisfaction would have been programmed out of existence. The ultimate tragedy. In the end, Miquella's story is one of the great tragedies of Elden Ring. He started from a place of genuine compassion. He really did care about his sister, really did want to help the persecuted, really did envision a world where suffering was minimized. These were noble impulses, driven by real empathy and authentic concern. But somewhere along the way, he lost sight of the fact that the means matter as much as the ends. He convinced himself that if his goal was good enough, any method of achieving it was justified. He told himself that taking away people's free will was acceptable if it meant creating a world without cruelty. He rationalized violating the sanctity of the individual mind by focusing on the beautiful vision he would create once everyone's mind had been properly adjusted. This is how idealism curdles into tyranny. This is how compassion becomes cruelty. This is how someone who starts by wanting to help people ends up becoming the worst kind of monster. Miquella looked at suffering and took the wrong lesson from it. Instead of recognizing that suffering is part of what gives meaning to joy, that struggle is what makes achievement valuable. That pain is what makes us cherish pleasure. He decided suffering was simply bad and needed to be eliminated at any cost. He couldn't see that a life without the possibility of suffering is a life without the possibility of genuine happiness. That comfort without the risk of discomfort is numbness rather than contentment. That love without the possibility of heartbreak is just programmed affection, hollow and meaningless. He wanted to save everyone from pain, and in doing so he would have stolen from them everything that makes being alive worthwhile. His abandonment of St. Trina symbolized this transformation perfectly. She was the part of him that understood love, that could feel compassion without needing to control. She was his conscience, the voice that might have warned him he was going too far, that might have pulled him back from the brink. And he discarded her like she was trash, like she was an impediment to his ascension, rather than the best part of who he was. By the time Miquella reached the Divine Gate, there was nothing left of the person who had planted the Haligtree, who had researched ways to cure his sister, who had wanted to create a sanctuary for the persecuted. He had cut away everything human about himself in pursuit of becoming a god, and what remained was a hollow vessel filled with dangerous certainty, convinced of his righteousness, unable to doubt, unable to fear, unable to love, yet determined to force everyone else to love him and each other. St. Trina's final words sum it up perfectly. Godhood would be Miquella's prison. A caged divinity is beyond saving. She understood what he couldn't, that in becoming a god he was destroying himself more completely than any enemy could, that the prison he was building bar by bar, cross by cross, abandonment by abandonment, was one he would never escape. That the age he sought to create would imprison not just the lands between but his own soul, trapping him in eternal isolation, surrounded by puppets pretending to love him, forever unable to experience genuine connection because he had thrown away his capacity to form such connections. This is the ultimate tragedy of Miquella the Kind. He was terrifying not because he was evil, but because he was good in the worst possible way. He wanted to help, wanted to heal, wanted to save everyone, and in pursuit of that noble goal, he became something worse than any of the unambiguously evil forces in the lands between. Because at least with obvious evil, you know what you're fighting. But with Miquella, you were fighting someone who looked like a savior, who sounded like a savior, who believed himself to be a savior, even as he worked to destroy everything that made salvation meaningful. The legacy and lasting horror. In the aftermath of Miquella's defeat, the lands between had to grapple with what he had represented. The Haligtree, which had been his greatest achievement, stood as a monument to both his vision and his betrayal. It was dying, rotting from within, but it was still there, still sheltering some of those who had nowhere else to go. The Albinaurics and Misbegotten who had believed in Miquella's dream didn't simply vanish when he died. They remained, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to understand how their savior had also been their potential doom. Some of Miquella's research survived and continued to help people. The techniques for crafting unalloyed gold, the needles that could hold back the influence of outer gods, these were genuine contributions that saved lives. Millicent, a young woman afflicted with scarlet rot, carried one of Miquella's needles, and it gave her years of life she wouldn't have had otherwise. The knowledge Miquella had developed outside the Golden Order fundamentalism opened pathways for others to explore, ways of understanding magic and divinity that didn't rely on the established order. But all of that good was tainted by what Miquella had been willing to do in pursuit of his goals. How many people had he charmed over the decades? How many lives had he manipulated? Identities had he overwritten? Minds had he violated? The full count would never be known. Some of his victims were obvious, like Mohg and Ansbach, and the countless followers he gathered in the Land of Shadow. But how many others had encountered Miquella over the years, had been charmed, had been sent off to serve his purposes in ways they thought were their own choices? The question haunted those who learned the truth. It raised uncomfortable questions about any act of kindness, any moment of compassion, any feeling of affection. If someone as seemingly benevolent as Miquella could use love itself as a weapon, how could anyone trust their own feelings? How could you know if your love for someone was genuine or if it had been implanted by magic? How could you be certain that your choices were your own? This paranoia was perhaps Miquella's final curse on the lands between. He had shown that the mind itself wasn't safe, that your thoughts and feelings could be rewritten by someone with sufficient power and will. Even after his death, the fear remained. Not fear of Miquella specifically, but fear of what he had proven was possible. If one person had figured out how to compel love, others might discover the same technique. The sanctity of the individual mind had been violated, and that violation couldn't be undone. The Cleanrot Knights who survived faced a particular crisis. They had devoted their lives to serving Miquella and Malenia, had watched their bodies rot away in service to that devotion, had believed with every fibre of their being that they were fighting for something noble, learning that their devotion might have been manufactured, that they might have been charmed into serving, that their sacrifice might not have been their choice, was devastating beyond measure. Some of them couldn't accept it, insisted until their dying day that their loyalty had been real, that they had chosen to serve. Others fell into despair, feeling that their entire lives had been stolen from them, that everything they thought they were was actually someone else's programming. Malenia, if she survived her battle with travelers to the Haligtree, would face the worst crisis of all. Her entire identity was wrapped up in being the blade of Miquella. If he had charmed her from childhood, if her devotion had been compelled rather than chosen, then who was she really? What remained of Malenia once you stripped away the loyalty that had defined her entire existence? These were questions that might not have answers, wounds that might never heal. She would be left standing in the ruins of the Haligtree waiting for a brother who would never return, uncertain whether she was mourning him or mourning the person she might have been if he had never touched her mind. Conclusion. As we come to the end of Miquella's tale, we're left with uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. Questions about the nature of goodness, about whether noble goals can justify terrible methods, about the difference between genuine compassion and control disguised as caring. Questions about free will and its value, about whether a perfect world created through mind control would really be perfect, about what it means to be a person if your thoughts and feelings can be rewritten on a whim. Miquella the Kind is the most terrifying god in Elden Ring, not because of his power, though he was immensely powerful, not because of his cruelty, though his actions were profoundly cruel, but because he was the most dangerous kind of villain, one who believes he's a hero, one who commits atrocities while convinced he's saving people, one who violates the most sacred boundaries while thinking he's being kind. He shows us that evil doesn't always come with horns and fangs. Sometimes it comes with a gentle voice and a promise to make everything better. Sometimes it wears the face of an innocent child and speaks in terms of compassion and love. Sometimes the most monstrous thing you can do is convince yourself that you're saving people while you destroy what makes them human. In a game full of cosmic horrors and monstrous gods, Miquella stands out as uniquely terrifying because his horror is intimate and personal. The frenzied flame would burn you to ash, but at least your mind would remain your own until the end. The scarlet rot would consume your body, but your thoughts would still be yours as you died. Miquella would let you live, would even make you happy, but you would no longer be you, and you would never know what you had lost because the part of you that could mourn that loss would have been overwritten with devotion to the being who had stolen it. The next time you encounter someone promising to create a perfect world, to eliminate suffering, to make everyone get along in perfect harmony, remember Miquella. Remember that the most dangerous tyrants are often those who believe they're saviors. Remember that love without choice isn't love at all. Remember that a world without the freedom to be cruel is also a world without the freedom to be genuinely kind. Remember that the most terrifying thing anyone can do to you isn't to destroy your body, but to reach into your mind and rewrite who you are. Miquella wanted to create an age of compassion. Instead, he became a warning about what happens when compassion becomes compulsion, when kindness becomes control, when the desire to help people transforms into the belief that you have the right to remake them in your image. His story is a horror story, not about monsters that attack from outside, but about the monster that lives inside good intentions taken to their logical extreme. In the end, Miquella represents perhaps the deepest fear we can experience as thinking beings, the fear that we might not be ourselves, that our thoughts might not be our own, that everything we believe about who we are could be a lie written by someone else. He proved that this fear could be made real, that the sanctity of the self could be violated, that love itself could become a weapon used to destroy everything that makes us human, and that, perhaps more than anything else in the lands between, is what makes him the most terrifying god of all. Not because of what he was, but because of what he wanted to make everyone else become. Not because of the world he destroyed, but because of the world he wanted to create. A world of perfect peace, perfect harmony, perfect love, where no one would ever suffer again because no one would be capable of being truly human anymore. If this story has kept you company tonight, if you've found some comfort or fascination in this tale of divine horror, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more stories from the lands between to explore, so many more dark corners to illuminate, so many more nightmares to examine in the gentle light of narrative. Until next time, rest well and remember, sometimes the most dangerous thing in the world is someone who wants to save it. Good night.